All right, so Ben and all right, and I'm already forgetting the name of the panel members.
Anna's there.
And
Anna's there.
Julie's here. Good.
Anna's here too.
All right, fantastic. So we got everybody here. So this is the stakeholders panel. So the objective of this one is to understand what, and this actually applies to almost everybody here as a stakeholder, what you want to get out of the a resource prospecting evaluation campaign, and in particular, what needs to be done in order to meet your needs so you can be an active participant. And so what we've tried to do is invite some representatives from each of the areas that stakeholders would belong to, such as industry, government, and Clive and academia. But this is going to lead to my very first question, which is, have we invited all the needed stakeholders? And this is before we get into questions from the audience, but have we invited all the needed stakeholders, and have we defined who the stakeholders should be for an evaluation campaign, right? And related to that is, how best can we do this? And I ask this question because we've invited you guys, but we don't have representations from DoD or from NASA ESDMD or SMD, though we do have it from NASA STMD. So how are we doing, first off, on being inclusive in terms of getting stakeholders invited into this conversation? And anybody can jump in and answer that inclusivity question. Nobody wants to.
Oh, okay, then
I'll
I'll withdraw on first, and then people can think good thoughts and follow me. I guess it's the one thing I don't think we've had a lot of discussion about from a stakeholder perspective are the potential customers down the road. And that's either customers of the data or potentially customers of the resource itself. And I think at what level you try and keep a customer happy, at what point is there a customer, I think is key. And I think Carlos and Gabriel made some really good points. And as Carlos talked about, in the mining industry, government pays for the initial survey. And then they get enough data to be dangerous, if you like, so that other people can decide whether to invest. And that meshes a little bit with what Gabriel said about, in that scenario, it's okay for the data to be public. But if you're expecting commercial to pay to have that data collection, you've got to not to over-regulate. Anyway, but your question was actually just about stakeholders. So yeah, customers.
And I would agree with Ben. We don't have a lot of customers on this, and identifying all of those long range customers. So not just who's going to be using this information in the next 5 years, who's going to be using it in 30 years, right? What does that long range plan look like? And who needs to be involved in those early steps in identifying where the resources are? Because I think it really changes the way that you plan the missions and the way that you plan the overall infrastructure, right? If you don't identify where those resources are.
Yeah, and to that end, I mean, there's always talk about customers and getting, industry to offer a price point or whatever it is for a resource. And if anybody who's ever been to a space resources roundtable knows that every discussion is about anchor tenants, anchor customers, and building off of that and creating that. So, it's sort of hard at this stage to define those, because it could be a lot of people. It could be any of these CLIPS vendors. It could be, it could be a lot of things. So it's sort of hard to say that. I will say that NASA, in the role that Jerry and I play, we do kind of cross the mission directorates. So while we do represent STMD, we do try to loop in the interests of ESDMD and SMD. But again, that's a very limited NASA perspective. So certainly getting broader industry into this and committing, but it's hard for them to commit at this stage, just as it's hard for any of us to.
Well, and I think it goes a little bit beyond just the customer identification. It's the process so that customers can identify themselves, right? If there's a long-term plan that says, this is what we're going to need in the future, here's how much water we're going to need, here's how much regolith we're going to need, all of these different things, then those customers can self-identify, right? That they're going to be a future provider of that service. regardless of what that service costs, or what that price tag is for it. And so again, looking at it from that long range view and publicizing it beyond just the space community, right? Because there are a lot of industries that need to be getting involved in order to make this successful, and we don't really see them participating in these type of forums.
Yeah, agreed. And just to pile on so that Carl doesn't get to ask any more questions at all and we take up the entire time. I think part of what Anne just said then feeds into it is the customers who will define what data and what quality of data has value. And this is all about someone at some point has to define the value, as Julie touched upon. And so we need a customer to say, hey, I want these data of this quality, and that feeds again into Laz made a very good point that I don't think is raised enough. It's going to take a lot of expertise to do the derived products, not just the raw data. So we need to understand what those derived products are and then work backwards to know what the data are to get them.
I'm going to come at this from a different angle. We need a market in order to get customers. And NASA has been charged with our current space policy to create a permanent human presence on the moon. That seems to me they're a customer, that they could set that market and be a customer if they would commit to establishing that permanent human presence, because that is a long-term commitment that gives investors confidence that this so-called anchor tenant is going to be around for a while, and then it would then sort of, I think, focus us on the evaluation campaign and the data fidelity issues. So I see a chicken and egg thing going on here. That cycle needs to be broken, and I think we have the way to do that. So because NASA could go back to Congress and say, oh, on the basis of our evaluation campaign, we don't think we can live off the land and create a permanent human presence on the moon. Or they could say, well, yes, we can. So it could be enabling either way. At least we'd know. But I think this is where we get to the paralyzed by inactivity. We need to do something in order to break that logjam so that we get definitive answers.
Follow up on that one, and then I want to follow up on a comment from Ron Freeman. But follow up on Clive's comment then. Do we have the right representatives from NASA here who would be the stakeholders as the primary anchor customers? Do we need to reach out more? That could be to Julie. Put you on the spot.
I'll try. I mean, so many of you know, the NASA's got a system capability leadership team. Jerry Sanders is the lead for that. I'm his deputy on that team. It's meant to be cross-mission directorate, and it's meant to be a discipline specialist to direct strategy. So in our case, ISRU to NASA as a whole across agencies. So hypothetically, the NASA customers would be kind of coming to us, or we would be involved in that in some. So in the ideal scenario, you hit us, and hopefully we can get that message out and go on from there. That said, there's always struggles with, stovepiping between the mission directorates and individual programs, and we're not, oblivious to this sort of thing. So certainly we struggle a little bit with that. From the SMD side, I can say that getting the message to SMD that science perspective missions, so those that are looking at volatiles from more of a science perspective in a broader sense, doesn't necessarily equal what we need for an ISRU to define the resources and turning that into a reserve. So getting that message to SMD is something we're pushing on, and certainly the more places they hear it, the better. From an ESD MD perspective, the challenge is always this: you can't fly it till it's flown idea where you have to prove that you can do it before you do it. And the struggle there is getting that commitment of infusion to, you know, whatever ESDMD is doing in terms of Artemis and habitats and whatnot. So those are sort of the angles that we have to keep pushing on, and that the more places that is heard at those levels, the better.
Julie, thank you. And for what it's worth, I think we do have some NASA representatives from not STMD online listening. So we are making some progress there. As you point out, it's a chicken egg problem, right? We need to get commitment from the major stakeholder to do that. As part of that, if we can, here's a thought I'm going to leverage on from Ron's question, which is media has a stakeholder in this. He thinks of the space age during the Kennedy era for congressional willingness to increase the budget for Apollo. I think that is a very important point. I would like you all to comment, not just media as a stakeholder, but because this is an international campaign. How about international nations that actually would not be flying the missions, but may want to be included in it? Because after all, the moon is something that we all see in the sky every day, right? Or almost every day when it's not raining. So to what extent should we push more toward media and also international inclusion for countries that normally would not be part of this? And how can we use that to leverage and actually entice NASA and ESA to put more funding into developing a sustained presence?
I think you have Artemis Accords as a place to start. That has brought in a number of smaller players, or those that have aspirations to play in this game, and I see that as being enabling in that respect. But the Artemis Accords is not a fix-all. There are some big players that won't sign it. So it's a start, but it's not the solution. Is the way I'm looking at it.
So I'm going to be like a politician and say thank you for the question and answer a different question. And actually, because I wanted to touch upon, didn't get a chance to respond to Clive, because I think Clive has something there in what he said, and I'd like to throw out a theoretical example. As you know, Julie talked about anchor customers and things, but let's take something like power. Let me throw out a scenario where I don't think NASA's going to say permanent presence like Clive would like them to, but they could say, we guarantee that we will buy X amount of power for X number of years. And if they could do that, that would allow companies to decide to put down power generating capability that is at least as much as they know NASA will purchase or another space agency will purchase. And that could start to build up infrastructure, and power could then be an enabling infrastructure for allowing people to think about doing resource extraction and learning to get those data. And it also then feeds into, Carl, what you said about getting smaller players involved, because if something like that can get a piece of infrastructure on the surface, like power, then that might allow smaller agencies with more limited budgets to still do exciting, useful things because they can leverage the infrastructure that the larger agencies have helped to make occur. And at the same time, they would help commercial companies do the prospecting because they know there's a power source there for them.
So to follow on to what Ben was saying and to answer Carl's question. So with Carl's question, we have this fantastic opportunity right now in that we're getting ready to launch SLS, right? It's going to be big. It's going to be amazing. We're going to actually go back to the moon with something that is human rated. But I will tell you, I have friends and family who are not involved in the space business and have no idea that it's getting ready to happen. Right. And so we do have a media issue in terms of we can't get or haven't gotten the American people, much less the rest of the world, excited about space and excited about what we want to go and accomplish on the lunar surface. And unless we get that, I think it's going to be very difficult to go and get the investment, not just in the United States, but in other countries, because it's taxpayer money for the most part. And there are other problems that people think are more important that need to be solved. And so we do have a bit of a marketing campaign, right, to go after. in order to make some of these things successful and make the funds available to make this happen. And then to follow on Ben's comment, I think, again, if we have that long range picture that says, like you said, NASA is willing to buy this much, right? It's very much like the way you do an LNG plant, right? So how can we look at other industries and the way that they actually go and develop, right? You don't go build an LNG plant on the Gulf Coast until you have offtake agreements that have at least 60%, right, of that LNG is already sold before they ever start building and breaking ground on that LNG plant. So how can we go look at the power market or the water market or whatever other commodity that we're going to go and leverage and figure out how much is necessary, right, and sell it? Because then you're going to be able to get those commercial entities to go and make the investment to go and build that research, build that plant. The other part of that, though, comes back to the policy, right? If you identify a resource and there's no way to protect it, and I'm not saying, I mean, we have things in place right now that says you can claim this portion and leverage those resources. The problem is, what happens when a non-cooperative entity lands right next to you and takes that resource? There really isn't an enforcement mechanism yet in place in order to protect those resources. And that's where investors start to back off and say, okay, this sounds really interesting and really, forward thinking, and they see where the market could go, but there's not enough assurance there that it can be enforceable. Just like you wouldn't sign an NDA with a company you don't trust, right? Because you don't think they're going to keep and protect your information. Investors aren't willing to give money if they don't think they can get it back, right? And if there's no way to protect it.
All right.
I just want to add to that a little bit. We do have a marketing issue, and this is something that in my copious amounts of spare time I've been thinking about a little bit in terms of why do we actually want to do this? And it's the return on the taxpayer investment that needs to be emphasized here. NASA did a really interesting thing a couple of years ago. They commissioned a report on the economic impact of NASA and showed how much revenue NASA, taxpayer investment in NASA actually makes. If we look at why are we doing this? Why are we going out? Why are we going to do this lunar resource evaluation campaign? It's the potential for the feedback to make society better on Earth. It starts with the initial job creation. What are our graduates going to do? These highly technically trained students that come out of universities, what are they going to do? The idea of going to work in space is appealing. It certainly is at Notre Dame, at least in the College of Engineering, College of Science, is the idea of working on an issue that is going to take humans beyond this planet is really appealing to them. So I think that we have a good product. We just need to develop the message that's going to do that. And the return on the taxpayer investment is something that certainly resonates with Congress.
Well, and also the what's in it for me.
Yep.
Right. It needs to be very individualized to individuals within the American population. What's in it for them specifically? And if we can answer that question, then you don't have to sell it anymore. You have people start to pull, right, and to talk to Congress and say, we want this, right, versus NASA pushing to say you need this.
Yeah, got it.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I actually want to follow up on what's in it for me and ask you a question on what's in it for me from you as a company perspective. But before I do that, I want to read a comment from Sarah. This stuff starts streaming off my screen. Okay, there is a recommend browsing Inmarsat's What on Earth is the Value of a Space report. It's a illuminating report regarding public perception of space, and maybe there is something that we can leverage from that. But also Brian Harvey mentioned that Apollo wasn't completely endorsed by the American public back in the day, so we don't have to have 100% endorsement here within U.S. or internationally. But they were behind it, since it was certainly part of the space race and in general wanted to beat the Russians. So I would agree that it makes sense. We could get active support at least, and certainly not a negative attitude about it, which I think is the point about getting media involved. I don't know about you all, but sometimes when I mention resource extraction from the moon, the common reaction is, why are you going to screw up the moon? You're already screwing up the Earth. And so I think it's very important that we message exactly what we're doing, which includes things like the scale of what we're planning to do. And then, of course, how it can benefit them. So I think that you all have some great points. But where I want to go to now is what is in it for you, from either academia, industry, or government? So what are your thoughts on how a prospecting campaign would have to be architected in order to inspire your involvement? Because you are stakeholders. What does its attributes have to be? What do its attributes have to be so that you're interested? And what should we avoid having as attributes that would then repel you from participating? And I'll start with Anne. You're shaking your head the most. So there we go.
Need to watch that. A very bad poker face. So I think for us, we're again that kind of tertiary company. So we're not one of those companies that would be the end user, right, of whatever is built. We're a construction company, right? So the things that we care about are the things that would impact our ability to do construction on the lunar surface. So making sure that we have a good understanding of, again, where, right? The prospecting mission can help identify those areas that we want to actually go and explore and set up, as Clive referenced, the permanent presence, right? What is going to make that possible for us to do that? And where are those opportunities? Because that does change your design, right? It changes the way that you approach the problem if you understand where you're starting from. But also understanding what you're going to be processing, right? Because that, just like any other mining operation, is really important to the design of the operation itself. And so being able to really have a definitive answer of what is there rather than doing that remote sensing information. And then again, we're here to help, right? That's really our goal. We tend to do the first of a kind projects that are those first mover type of opportunities. And so again, how can we help? Right. And it may not be that we set the guidelines for what needs to be done in the prospect mission, right? We're here to say, have you considered, right? Or how can we use that data in the future versus defining the upfront requirements.
Okay, thanks. So you need rigorous information, both on the knowledge of what's there, so you know what to deploy or build, and also a rigorous plan so you know exactly how to help. And I can make proposals for that, both of which still need to be done. Ben, your thoughts on how the architecture should be done to both entice you but not repel?
Yeah,
guys.
happy to go second. I think there's a few things here, and you are specifically to understand what our company's kind of perception is. One, I really enjoyed the regulation panel. It raised a lot of good points. I would say respectfully, we need to be careful that we regulate to a level that we don't stop investment. And that doesn't mean no regulation at all. It just means I think it's a very delicate balance on how we do that. And I'm glad there's lots of people thinking about it. For your specific question is, how does someone like Intuitive Machines get involved, or is made to care? I think as a lunar services company, it's interesting listening, because I could see there's two avenues, which is companies like us could be just a company that someone uses our capabilities. So we can provide lunar surface access for people who want it, or comm relay access. So you've got companies like us which represent infrastructure that others can use, but also companies like us could choose to go get the data, but then there has to be, and this touches upon what Anne said, we have to understand what people want to know. Are we acquiring something that we can sell, both because it has value to somebody else, but also are we allowed to sell it from a regulation perspective?
Okay. Julie, you're our primary stakeholder. NASA will probably be the anchor customer, at least initially, or maybe another government agency. So what are your thoughts on, to the extent you can say, on what needs to be done? And I realize to a large extent NASA is one that would be doing it. So it's kind of speaking to yourself, but still your thoughts would be appreciated very much.
Yeah, and if you look at NASA's overarching goal. And if you look at the Moon to Mars, actually blueprint objectives, right? All of this talks about NASA bringing up the technology and getting to a point and handing it off, right? So that's kind of our goal, is to kind of get it to the point where we can hand it off. But even with that, you know, we're in a position now where the ISRU trade space is still very open. Do we go for the water? Do we just get oxygen from the minerals? What do we do? What's the first step? And what do we bring up and start bringing up? And how do we invest whatever resources we have wisely and best, right? So certainly, and STMD has for quite a while been talking about this dual path approach, at least for the initial ISRU being, bring up the technologies for water extraction and bring up the technologies for oxygen extraction, with an eye towards metals as well. And sort of, what is our decision point with that, and how do we go there? And a lot of that has to do with our confidence and this whole discussion about, getting the resource and turning that into a reserve and for it to be viable. And of course, there's a lot of open information. So whatever we can do to narrow that risk down to at least start ISRU on the moon and get to that decision point is helpful. We talk about Viper being a first start, and it is. It's certainly not the end game. And to say what Viper gives us is going to drop water ISRU forever is never our intention, or go with ISRU, water ISRU only. That's not our intention, but certainly it would help. So I think a campaign, any information we can get is helpful. Whatever the campaign is has to at least be cognizant of resources and timelines. So if you tell me I need 50 missions with 50 rovers that look like um, Curiosity, I don't know that that's going to fly. So we do have to, whatever we come up with here, and whatever we bring forward does have to be at least cognizant of constraints which are not defined, which is the problem, and the limitations of the different agencies and the timelines that we want to move at. So that's not a real answer, but it's at least touching on some of it.
It did. It touched upon it very nicely. And I want to then ask each of you the pointed question: then what is the next first step on this implementation of a of a prospecting campaign, so that we could potentially get back on the timeline, which, if I remember, NASA's timeline is the pilot plant of some sort operating on the moon by the end of the decade. And if it's going to be water ice extraction, it needs to do a lot of things to find the water ice. So from the perspective of water ice as the resource of interest right now, what should be the next step in the implementation of this campaign?
I'm going to start this one, and I'm going to say we need to coordinate those missions that are up there, on the way there, and are scheduled to go there, to then look at the potential water ice deposits from orbit.
Okay, I'm push back on you, Clive, a little bit on that. You're not wrong, but for that to happen, some group has to define what are those measurements, to what fidelity, and also if a private entity is prepared to go get those data of different regions, is someone going to pay them to do it, or are there agents? Yeah, so you're not wrong, but you're not right either.
Well, the devil is in the details, Ben.
Yeah.
But if we can establish coordination on existing missions, that can then be a foundation for establishing coordination with surface missions.
And I would like to stress too the stuff that Laszlo was talking about, and getting those models and those that is the core of what we need, and whatever these missions are bringing back need to be fed into that and that needs to be available, right? So everybody can figure out their derived products by themselves and make best guesses themselves, but having a coordinated effort to pull that in and sort of push it out is really sort of the pivotal key to me for how to do this.
Well, and I would actually ask and look at the problem a little bit differently and ask the question, why are we doing it? Right. So if water ice in the next decade is right, and what we're doing, is that the goal? Because that really answers a lot of the questions that the market has in terms of, if the why is because we're going to go and put a permanent human presence similar to McMurdo Station or something like that, and we need that ISRU water in order to make it happen, that changes the speed with which you develop it. It changes how much you need, which changes where you might actually locate and all of those sort of things. And so I think defining that question or that answer to the question of why will help everything else fall out because it allows us to ask the right questions.
I totally agree. And I'd like to add a little bit, which is if it isn't water, if it's oxygen, if people decide that oxygen is enabling, I think MOXIE on Mars was hugely important because it showed it can be done. And now it's a scaling engineering problem. And all the theory said it would work, it worked, and that's great. And I would say the same thing from oxygen from regolith. You could make a decision now to somehow incentivize, or an agency just choose to demonstrate generating oxygen from lunar regolith. And the moment you've done that once, then you can, and it's all very well to model how you think it'll do and test it on Earth. The moment people see oxygen generated from lunar regolith, I think it changes things. I think then again, it's an engineering scaling problem depending on how much of it you want.
Yeah, and I 100% agree. And that also then, because all of these things take power and they take other infrastructure in order to make them happen, if you define the problem you're trying to solve, the rest of it comes with it. Everybody understands how much power you're going to need, right? Moxie takes power, right? It was able to do it with onboard power. But is that really, when you talk about scaling, is that the way you want to move forward in the future, right? Do these need to be permanent power plants that are located in a specific location because we're only going there, right? Or is it something that needs to be mobile, that needs to be able to move around the lunar surface as we go and prospect and change? So again, answering that first question of why we're there and what the end goal is helps define all of those other mission objectives.
Yeah, and I'll say too that, and 2 points. One, we were talking about messaging and media and talking about ISRU, but to Ann's point, it really needs to be, getting behind establishing, a reason to be there in a sustainable way, right? We're not going to put ISRU there if we're only doing sorties every once in a while, right? The second point I would say is there's, sort of this developing regime or building capability where we have sort of the early campaign and the early missions, and then how that builds and grows into a longer term. And that's sort of buildup of sorties to habitats and the buildup of NASA to industry, right? And certainly there's different targets for those where, maybe you start with oxygen extraction and get that low-hanging fruit in terms of, the oxygen propellant. And then you say, okay, but if we're going to stay here, we really want to go after the water. So we still need to develop that. So, I mean, there's different opportunities and levels to fit in here and infuse. But certainly that definition of how that's all going to go is sort of the key, right? And trying to understand that. And whatever Artemis has planned, it is a great start. And moving on from there is really the handoff.
Thank you. Yeah, that was very good. It moved a little bit away from water only into metals and regular, which is also another resource that we can't forget about. And it moved, and your discussion moved into what missions to fly to for some, to some degree. And that's one last question, maybe not the last question, but again, implementation is what this session is about. So I want to ask you, in your mind, what's the best way to implement the first mission for prospecting in terms of combining NASA involvement, which part of NASA, industry involvement, and international involvement? And you could pick whatever aspect this mission, whether it's an orbiter that collects data, and then who pays for it, stuff like that. So my last question for you is, Give me your vision on the next step of the implementation, or the first step, really, after Viper, that's dedicated to implementing a prospecting campaign that combines government, industry, academia, and everybody. I'll start with Clive, your center screen.
Really? That's a first. All right. I think the first step is we have a wealth of orbital data. And we've talked about getting better resolution neutron data. Your talk, Carl, was very specific in showing that that would be useful. So, you know, getting better neutron data if we're going after the water ice at the poles is good, but we need to think multiple steps ahead. What does the first step lead to? What is the second step? What is the third step? So we build up capability. So, for example, we could use what we already know and has been published in the literature with the Cannon and Britt's ice favorability matrix. You've got the Brown et al. Top 10 PSRs that, on the basis of our current data, show the most likelihood for having good water ice holding capability. But we also need to think about technology that will be able to work in those extreme environments. And I know L6 got the focus group looking at that, and marry those two together so that we can set up a target list with data requirements, and then bring together our coordination team that is going to say, well, we're going to go to Shackleton. We found a way through KPLL to get into Shackleton and out again, or we can land directly in there and we can be alive for 48 hours and do some great innovative science there to tell us the potential for water ice there. But we also need those data from other areas, especially those close to the Artemis landing zones, where potential base camp could be set up, a fixed base camp, not a mobile one. I think that's important for infrastructure development, and it can only be developed around somewhere where we have a lot of resources that can be able to be used to sustain humanity in the long term. So that bounds our problem a little bit, but we need to. It starts off with what we have. Now, what do we need to really know in order to make those decisions on the best place to put a base camp?
Ben, what are your thoughts?
To leverage off Clive, I'll give it, but at a almost like at a lower level to address your question. What is doable now that I think helps? Define data sets, both orbital and surface, that someone is prepared to pay for, and then people can go away and get them. So someone needs to come up with a menu and say, we'll buy this data at this quality for this price, and there can be ranges. And yes, I know there's issue with calibration and everything else, but if an agency isn't going to be dropping new hundreds of millions of dollars type missions to get these data, then we need to get them piecemeal over time. And I think that's a good first step, or should be thought about.
Thanks. And industry perspective from your point of view.
So I would actually go back and look at history, right? And the way that human expansion occurred on Earth, right? It went with water, right? They followed the water, because without water, you can't survive. And so what can we do in this case to go do prospecting and figure out where are those water sources enough that could actually be usable for sustainable presence? And of course, my goal and my vision, right, because it's just my own personal vision, is I want to see a sustained permanent presence on the lunar surface, and see that expand. My children all talk about being able to go and live on Moon and Mars. I've told them they can't unless they leave their children with me, because I want grandchildren. But still with that is looking at the history, right? How do we go and find And how do we go develop humanity on another location, right? And the first thing is go find the water, right? So what do we need to do with that? We have a lot of information from the orbital surveyors and things like that, but what needs to be done in order to identify mineable or extractable water on the lunar surface? I think Viper is going to give us a lot of answers on that. And so it might be that we need to wait and see what we learn from that mission before we make decisions on where to go next. There may be some things that we know we're not actually going to discover with Viper. Okay, well then let's go look at those things and figure out how to make those happen. And really defining that well thought out plan of why we're going and what the end goal is, and then let industry come in and help solve the problem, right? This doesn't need to be a problem only solved by NASA or other governments, right? If it's established of what it is and what people are willing to pay for it, industry will come and fill that gap, right? It just needs to be put out there in order to help, so they can come help solve the problem.
Thanks, Ann. Julie, being a NASA representative and the major stakeholder, like I mentioned before, currently that is, I'll let you tie this discussion off with your thoughts.
Yeah, and I guess I would reference back to what we put out in the LWIMS report, and that was very broad, but it defined sort of an approach to this, which is start with this sort of modeling effort and model development, and that's really what Viper is about, right? Getting the information needed to develop those models, then find a location that is of interest to an exploration campaign, right? Not just where there's water, but also where there's water and it overlaps interests of habitats and customers, right? And then try to validate that with a simple way possible. And then finally go into your, this is the site we're going to go to. Let's characterize the site fully before we put hardware down. So that was kind of the stepwise approach, where it's not about let's find the water everywhere and get the whole moon or get the whole region even. It's take the approach to minimize it down for at least the near term needs. And I'm talking from the NASA perspective. So, we have those Artemis locations. The new ones published for the Artemis 3 sites, which may or may not be where the habitats would be, or habitat would be. But we do have those locations, and trying to figure out how that overlaps ISRU interests, and then trying to really understand the water at those. And you mentioned my Ascend paper here coming up in 22 takes 6 of those sites and kind of looks at that to see, and most of those aren't the stuff that Brown et al. Identified as being those nice large PSRs where there's high confidence. There's not, right? These are smaller PSRs for the early campaigns. So that's sort of my approach, is a little more directed, a little more, let's get to a quicker answer for at least a site of interest to get us going. And actually defining the mission and the instruments to go on that mission, right? That speaks to those constraints about, okay, how many can we do? How much money do we have? And who all is going to be involved? And who can we direct to do that in terms of this is the data we need and help us get it? So that's the broader question that we're trying to touch on, and it's really hard to answer.
It is hard to answer. We need a plan. That seems to be the theme from each of you. Develop a plan now and commit to execute it. Okay, Clive, I think we're done with the session. Ran over 5 minutes.
It's all right.
But here we go.
We are in good shape.